Our guest on this edition of the Geopolitics and Empire podcast is Dr. Balihar Sanghera, who is the Director of Graduate Studies and Senior Lecturer on Sociology at the University of Kent's School of Social Policy. One of his research interests is geopolitics and competing economic imaginaries in Central Asia, which will be the theme of our discussion. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Sanghera.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Why don't we set the context with your publication, a piece you wrote on open democracy a few years ago on Kyrgyzstan, where you describe it as an economic dystopia. And I kind of feel this is endemic of the post-Soviet states as well in Central Asia, Kazakhstan, and other neighboring countries. And so can you describe a bit about Kyrgyzstan's economic dystopia, and then perhaps what are some things it can do to extricate itself from the plutocracy that influences it?
Great, yes. Well, that's a great question to start off with. I suppose we first have to understand what we mean by dystopia. And for me, how I'm using it is to suggest why and how people are facing suffering, harm, lack of well-being, damage to the environment, social fragmentation. So you get the sense that all these negative things are happening to a country. And so for me, that's how I understand the term dystopia. And this is obviously a far cry from the initial expectation when Kyrgyzstan embarked on market reforms, because it was held to be a utopic vision, a change from the past, the Soviet, and this would be heralding in a new times, a new era of well-being, of flourishing, of economic liberalization, etc. But what we've seen is with these market reforms is actually a shift in power between people, between those who own and control the resources and those who lack them but desperately need them. So let me give you an example of this. For instance, a lot of people need credit. Credit helps to turn the wheels of commerce. And clearly there are bankers, microcredit finance institutions that control money. And so they're the lenders, and on the other side, you've got the borrowers who just don't have enough and desperately need loans in order to make ends meet, to pay for emergencies, etc. So what we've seen in Kyrgyzstan, but also in other post-Soviet states in Central Asia, is the emergence of the power of the financial class, the bankers, the microfinancial institutions, who are able to charge high interest rates on the loans that they give out. Kyrgyzstan, a couple of years ago, had one of the highest interest rates in the world, and that in real terms, so taking into account inflation. And this high interest rate has resulted in many negative social outcomes. In order to pay back the loans, the high interest payments, many households had to migrate to the city, moving from their rural areas to the urban. Many also left to go to Russia, Kazakhstan. So about 10%, 10 to 50% of the population are migrants in one form or another. This has resulted in depopulation of the rural areas. It has also resulted in broken homes because usually the more able-bodied people from the household are able to leave, leaving usually the elderly to look after the children of the parents who have migrated. And it's also resulted in several cases in poor rural areas to suicide. And this is all in one way or another connected to the relationship between the lenders and the buyers, in which the lenders are able to charge high interest rates because they have a monopoly power. They can do what they want to do. They can justify their actions in terms of property rights, and the borrowers have no choice. So what we've seen is this liberalization of finance, the privatization of the banking sector. All these sounds very nice. But when you look at it on the ground and how it's been practiced, you see suffering, harm, injustice. This is what I mean by economic dystopia.
And in your article, you mentioned the interest rates in some cases went from up to 40 or 50%. And another point that you mentioned that was interesting regarding housing and real estate, where this elite class, plutocracy, oligarchy, whatever you want to call it, they would purchase a lot of luxury apartments and use them to clean money. And myself living in Kazakhstan, I've been considering investing either in real estate or other areas, and I've heard stories in Astana, an apartment. They're building like crazy all over the place in Kazakhstan, and in Astana, someone told me that there were just like 1, 2, 3, 4 entire floors of apartments or flats were purchased by one person, and that attests to what your article says, where these people buy the real estate and they launder or clean their money in this way, or preserve their money in that way. It's safer than keeping it in the bank, I guess, because perhaps the government could take it out of the bank. And then another point you make about economic rents, and perhaps you can explain this better. I might describe it as money that would be useful for the economy, but is otherwise stolen by this elite class. And it further kind of impoverishes the economy and population, because it doesn't really go into production or consumption. It just kind of gets out of the economy and sits there.
Yeah, no, all those points are valid and well articulated. There is something about the nature of how these very rich individuals, the ultra rich, the elite class, the plutocracy, or what we would call in economics, in political economy, we would call the rentier class. Why do we call them the rentier class? It's because they're able to make their income by extracting rent. And how are they able to extract rent? Through ownership and control of assets. That's how they extract rent, because they control things that other people desperately need, and other people are willing to pay high price in order to acquire those resources. So, like, for example, the interest rates. And also, likewise, with high property prices, or paying high rent on accommodation. And what is interesting, about this is that how this class of people, this plutocracy, this rentier class, are able to earn their income by doing nothing. They don't do anything. That's how. They get something for nothing. They don't contribute to the economy in any meaningful way. They're not like teachers or factory workers or retail assistants providing a service. They merely get their income because they have rights to those properties, and other people are willing to pay high prices for them. But the income itself is generated by other people. They have to do the hard work to pay for the high rent or to pay for the high interest rates. So the other part of this economic dystopia, as well as the suffering and the harm that's created, is the unfairness, the injustice of the system, in that there's this one powerful group of people who are able to earn income without contributing to the economy in any meaningful way, other than by just owning property. Ownership doesn't produce income. Ownership just gives you the right to that stream of income. It's through labor, it's through people's effort that income is generated. The owners of these assets, whether they be the bankers, whether they be the landlords, landowning class, the rich people who own apartments, they're able to generate income not through producing things, as in capitalism, but by just buying and selling existing assets. So the example that you gave about people buying multiple apartments, they do so because they know they can sit on an empty apartment, and in a couple of years' time, they will sell it and they will get capital gains out of it. They haven't done anything. They haven't contributed in any meaningful way in getting their income. They just bought and sold an existing asset. That's not contribution. That's just being parasitic on other people's labor.
And some of the solutions you mentioned in your article, I like how you called it the property politics nexus. You suggest anti-monopoly legislation, nationalizing some quasi-monopolies, and so on. But I'd like to move on now a bit to the new great game, whatever you want to call it, between USA, China, and Russia for Central Asia. I kind of feel for the US, it's been an area that it has neglected for a while because it has been occupied in other parts of the world. And why don't we go one by one, look at the US in Central Asia, Russia's interests, and then China's, and then bring it all together. You've written on the effects of neoliberalism and the Washington Consensus in Central Asia, which is working to privatize industries, open markets. And in Kazakhstan, we're kind of just now really starting to see that happen. In Astana, just a few months ago, they opened their second stock market, the Astana International Financial Center, in a hope to bring in foreign direct investment. And they're privatizing much of their industry, or trying to, which includes banking and telecommunications and aviation. And so what has been the legacy of the Washington Consensus in Central Asia from the U.S. Perspective?
Oh, yeah, great question. And let me answer that in two parts. I think the lasting legacy has been the rewriting of property rights. So getting away from the collective communal rights that existed to individualizing them, to making them private. And that's important for capitalism. That's important for the rentier class. Because remember earlier I was saying how the rentier class, the plutocracy class, are able to generate their income through ownership and control of assets. Well, that can only happen if they have ownership, private property rights to those assets. So the rewriting of the property rights has been a key part of their strategy. And the Washington Consensus is very much about trying to make the market economy work in which individuals have property rights. But of course, these are not just merely any individuals. These are invariably the very rich individuals who have much of the monopoly control over valuable, scarce assets like oil fields, gold mines, and also, of course, money. Rewriting of the property class, of the property rights, has been underpinned by the juridical system, the courts, the judges, the lawyers, and the international courts, the tribunal courts, who all acknowledge the importance of property rights and seek to ensure that the state or any group of people cannot take away existing property rights on the basis of social justice, for instance. When you had the breakup of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, the rewriting of the property and land laws were a key part of the Washington Consensus. USAID, international development agencies, the World Bank, the International Monetary System, and many others played a key part in trying to ensure that the property rights system was that which was aligned with capitalism, effectively. So that's been a key legacy, and that will remain forever, I think, unless there's some sort of social revolution to bring about a change of property rights towards a more collective, nationalized rights, which is one of the ways in which it would control plutocracy, for instance. I think the other legacy of the Washington Consensus is the establishment of unequal relationships between people in the economy. So what do I mean by this? The economy isn't just about producing things. The economy consists of social relationships between people. And this social relationships is one of inequality under the influence of Washington Consensus. So let me give you a couple of examples of this. So when we think about employer-employee relationship, one of the things that the Washington Consensus has been involved was instrumental was in dismantling workers' rights, the collapse of the trade union movement in the post-Soviet space. I've already spoken about the lender-borrower relationship, in which the rights of the lenders is prioritized over that of the borrowers. Another one would be the relationship between donors and recipients. I mean, one of the things about this post-Soviet space is the influence of international NGOs. And in this relationship is the international donors that are able to shape the agenda for various causes. And the recipients, the local organizations on the ground in Central Asia, are merely just vehicles for donors' interests. Another one would be the relationship between the state and the citizens. And we've seen the part of the Washington Consensus has been the decline, the dismantling of the welfare state. So I think when we think about the Washington Consensus, it's important to see it in terms of how social relationships between people have become uneven, unequal, and how this has resulted in the strong taking advantage of the weak, and in ways in which has resulted in the marginalized poorer groups lacking rights and not being able to have the means to flourish.
And we saw just a few weeks ago, Turkmenistan announced that they will stop subsidizing the essential aspects of life, so, electricity, water, and certain foodstuffs. And when I was living in Mexico, it was actually quite nice that the government was subsidizing electricity and water. My electricity bill in Mexico was literally only $5 a month, something like that, and the same for the water bill. So that allowed me as a citizen to save a lot of my income and have a better standard of living. And moving on to Russia's interests in Central Asia, Russia's presence is probably in Central Asia is the biggest because of the centuries of Russian imperialism. A lot of the Central Asian countries speak Russian. Kazakhstan is very interesting, where you have about a 20-30% Russian ethnic population, and everyone here they're bilingual. They speak Russian and Kazakh. And I believe it was in 1994 that the Kazakh president Nursultan Nazarbayev proposed the Eurasian Economic Union, which was then largely made material by the actions of Russia and President Putin. They seem to have based it on the EU model. And one of my questions is, is it now essential to form an economic and political structure akin to the EU to compete in the globalized world? And as well, they've proposed a Eurasian common currency, which seems a long way off. So what can you say about Russia in Central Asia, as well as this Eurasian project, and how it has been faring?
Yeah, I suppose it's important to say the Eurasia Economic Union was designed to deal with Russia's economic problem. And it's not necessarily one in which it's about the collective interest of the Eurasian countries. I think even though Nazarbayev articulated the union, it only really took off once it became apparent that it was in the interest of Russia's economy to have something like this. And why is it in the interest of Russia to have something like a regional integration? Partly because of its experiment with neoliberalism. What happened was that with the breakup of the Soviet Union, you had the economy open up. You had crony capitalism, privatization, in which the rich were able to acquire valuable assets and make their income from that. And in response to that, in response to both neoliberalism and globalization, the Russian economy just couldn't reproduce. It was floundering. The 1998 crash was an example of that. So it was very much the Eurasian Union was then really was designed to kind of think about what kind of integration could be in place that would be to the advantage of the Russian side. And I think that's probably the most important thing about the model. And part of that model is to counter the hegemonic power of the dollar, the dominance of the dollar in the region, in the Eurasian Union. Much of the economy, when I was in Russia and in Kyrgyzstan in the early 2000s, a lot of people would use the dollar as their main currency. And this provided the United States with unparalleled advantage. It gives the United States the ability to operate trade and budget deficits without having to control them, without having to cut back on their spending. And of course, much of their spending tends to be on military sector, giving them unequal advantage, giving them advantage over Russia. So part of the Eurasian Union is to weaken the influence, I think, of the dollar hegemony, and to then in that respect to enhance the power of the ruble. And we've seen that. One of the data that I've seen is the extent to which dollar is used in the Eurasian Union has fallen from 35% to 19% over the course of 5 years when the Eurasian Union started. So there have been attempts to weaken the dollar by using other currencies, and in doing so, to weaken the Washington consensus, to weaken United States, and thereby giving other economies in the region the chance to compete, in particular China and Russia. Do I see the ruble competing at the same level as the dollar? Maybe in Eurasia, yes, but at the global level, no. The US dollar has a considerable advantage in many other regions around the world, Latin America, Africa, South Asia. So I don't really see the Eurasian Union undermining the hegemonic power of the dollar. But I do see the Eurasian Union deepening ties between the member states to the advantage of Russia, and the tariff walls that have been built around Eurasia Union has been to the advantage of the Russian industry.
It would be interesting, just a thought experiment at some future date in Central Asia, where we might see the competing currencies of the petrodollar, the petro-yuan, and the Eurasian common currency. And I'd agree with you as well that the ruble, probably beyond the region, would not become much more influential or powerful. And that brings us to China's famous Belt and Road Initiative. It's a very interesting idea that on the surface seems to be win-win for all. China has problems such as its saturated domestic market, and so I guess it can utilize the Belt and Road to export some of its domestic industry, like it has with steel and other industries, into new neighboring countries and new markets. It seems to have the biggest potential in terms of influence in Central Asia, despite critics saying that it won't be able to deliver and that it's also a form of debt trap diplomacy, perhaps mimicking what the IMF and World Bank have been doing for decades, where they've been handing out loans and debt to foreign countries that were not able to pay them back, and then the IMF and World Bank taking possession of the real assets or collateral. We've interviewed previously not on this podcast, but on my previous channel, John Perkins, the economic hitman, who testified to that was his job, trying to convince foreign leaders to accept these debts. And so now it seems like some are saying China is doing that. How would you assess the geopolitical and economic significance of the Belt and Road in Central Asia?
Oh yeah, and I think you're right. The Belt and Road Initiative is an extremely powerful an imaginary in the region. And work that I'm doing with Dr. Elmira Satybaldieva is very much looking at the different competing imaginaries in the region. Whether it be the Belt and Road imaginary, or the Eurasian Union imaginary, or the Washington Consensus imaginary, and clearly, the Belt and Road is the new kid on the block, as it were. I suppose the question is, why did it occur? We have to remember again, the Belt and Road Initiative is not necessarily for the benefit of those countries. It's again designed to help a particular problem facing the designer, and in this case, is China. What was the problem? The problem was the problem of crisis of overaccumulation, arising over several decades of overdevelopment of the coastal regions in China, to the neglect of the western regions. So in many ways, the Belt and Road Initiative is about rebalancing the Chinese economy. So moving some of the capital from the coastal areas to the west, and hence why you then have Central Asia as being an important player in this, because of its connection with the Hijaz region, for instance, and Pakistan and India. Clearly, part of this Belt and Road Initiative is to make capital earnest money. It's to reproduce capital. It's to generate profit, which otherwise would become devalorized if it remained in China. With each of these imaginaries, I think, and especially with the Belt and Road Initiative, they are all capitalist models. They're not designed to be in any way redistributing wealth from the north to the south or anything like that. They're very much about trying to ensure that capital gets reproduced for the benefit of the major powers. So in that light, I kind of think that I would certainly differ with your assessment. I think I would say that there's little benefit for Central Asia. The countries that will benefit are those that have the most resources. Countries like Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, possibly Uzbekistan. But the minor countries, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, that have very little, are not likely to win in this model that's being proposed by China, other than just in terms of transit routes from the Chinese factories to mature markets in Europe or to emerging markets in the Middle East. So one of the connections, for example, that there's a new railroad that's been proposed it's probably been proved now, that would run from Western China through Kyrgyzstan and then to Uzbekistan, through Pakistan and then to Iran. And the purpose of this is to make the flow of capital work more efficiently, is to shorten the travel time of goods. And that's important for the reproduction of capital, to ensure the valorization of capital. So in that respect, it really, the benefits that Central Asian economies will have will depend very much how they are linked up with capital, with China. And other than the region being seen as trade routes for factory goods passing through these regions, or just merely acquisitions of much needed resources for Chinese economic security, like oil and gas from Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan, I see very little benefit for these countries.
And this brings me to my final question. I have visited China, Russia. I've lived in Mongolia. I currently reside in Kazakhstan. My take is I still do see this new great game between China, Russia, and the US on more or less an even playing field, and find it hard to place either of the three at a clear advantage. However, your assessment also does have weight to it and makes sense, where you say the US at the moment has the upper hand. One advantage you say is their ability to sabotage Chinese and Russian plans. You give the example of Ukraine, which I would say was essentially a coup d'etat, as well as the U.S. sanctions against Russia, which are not only hurting Russia, but affecting the Kazakh currency, the tenge, which is tied to in some ways to the Russian ruble, and the tenge has been getting knocked around recently. And so my Kazakh salary is affected by the interference of my own American government all the way on this part of the world. And also earlier this year, both the Kazakh and Uzbek presidents were invited by President Trump to the White House, and they sought beneficial relations. So I think there's a lot there that was said just by their visit. So what is your take on who is winning the new great game for Central Asia in terms of economic and geopolitical influence, or will all three powers keep each other in check?
Oh, great question. And I think you're right to point out the dominance of the United States and the Western powers, I think, for all those reasons. And if I can just also include, partly because the international financial institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, they all are in one way or another connected to the United States. We know the Treasury, the U.S. Treasury, sits on the board of IMF and World Bank. They can veto any plans that don't meet their interest. We also know that IMF and the World Bank have tried to sabotage any proposals for a petro-yuan currency, or the dominant, or for in any way the US dollar to become to continue its role as the world currency. So even though IMF and World Bank are purport to be neutral international agencies, they're far from that. They very much do the bidding of the United States. So I think the financial infrastructure, the international financial infrastructure, is very much in favor of the United States, and I think in that respect, Russia and China are going to struggle to put forward an alternative financial infrastructure. They're trying to do that, but they're a long way from that, and that will take a while. And I suppose for me, who's winning the new great game? I suppose the game is still one of capitalism. They're all playing the game of capitalism. They may have different ideas about the nature of capitalism, but they're all playing that game. They're not offering anything alternative to capitalism. I wish, Russia and China would put forward a counter capitalist project, but they're not. The Eurasian Union, the Belt and Road Initiative, they're just a version of the Washington Consensus capitalist project. Maybe the latter two are not as the Eurasian Union and the Belt and Road Initiative. They probably don't place as much emphasis on finance as the Washington Consensus. So they place more emphasis on production and investment and into infrastructure. But they all still do the same thing, which is about valorization of capital and the reproduction of capital in the global powers. So I think whoever is going to be the winners is going to be capitalists anyway. Who are the losers? It's the everyday people. And at the end of the day, I think one of the major losers is the environment. The environment will not gain from this relentless drive for growth that all the major powers are pursuing. It's not sustainable, the level of growth that Russia, China, and the United States wish to have. Reports from the United Nations suggest that we need to take action to make the world sustainable over the next 12 years. I just don't see anyone even playing that, undertaking those kinds of actions. So I'm very pessimistic about the nature of the game. I said the game is very much a capitalist game. And I think the losers are us, the people without assets, people without monopoly power of key valuable resources, and the planet, because the key winners are the plutocrats, whether in power or outside of the White House, but still able to have lobbying power.
That's a great place to end it. And do you have any final thought you'd like to make? Perhaps also mention any research you're working on going forward, and as well how people can best follow the work that you do.
Oh, great! Yes, thanks. My partner and I, Elmira Satybaldieva, we're currently working on a couple of projects looking at how the rich and powerful justify their economic relationships. Because we sometimes think that power just happens, but no, it needs to be justified. So, what kind of moral reasons, moral justifications do they use to depoliticize, normalize unequal relationships? So we've been working, looking at bankers, financial institutions, the judges, the judiciary, how all these people, all these very powerful people, are using moral reasoning as a way to disguise the sense of neutrality, the sense of equality, the sense of impartiality, when actually their economic relationships is one which favors them to the harm and suffering of others. So that's the work that we are currently embarking on. We have a project to write a book, a monograph of this, the political economy in Central Asia. We try to tie up the importance of the rentier class and with morality, and to pay particular attention to social inequality. I think one of the things that we have to always be fascinated by and take an interest in is, how does the economy work for the people? How are people's well-being harmed or nurtured or developed? So on one level, we can think about this in terms of a game between the major powers, but we must always be reflexive and always remind ourselves we're talking about people's lives, we're talking about people's social relationships in which people are vulnerable, needy, interdependent, in which the economy, the way the economy is shaped, tends to favor one group over another. And I think we always need to be mindful of that. And in terms of how people can best follow my work, I would recommend them to go to my University of Kent website. Just Google my name, Balihar Sanghera, and you'll be able to see the articles that I'm currently writing on.
All right, Dr. Sanghera, it's been a pleasure. We thank you for your time.
Thank you, and then thank you for the invitation. I really enjoyed this chat. Thanks.